Welcome to Sitting with Sallie. Today I'm interviewing Dr. Frederick Ross, or Rick, about two books that he's written, A Deadly Thaw and Desert Enigma. And we met in the most typical Kenora way at the farmer's market. I'm there selling books for the cat shelter as a fundraiser, and Rick Ross is selling his books for people who are interested in a good read. And welcome to Sitting with Sallie.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Before we get into talking about your books, I'd just like to talk a bit about what got you into writing and how you moved there.
A friend of mine was working for a radio station in Winnipeg several years ago. They were looking for some historical vignettes for their website, and he asked me if I would consider writing stories from back in the 50s and 60s, what it was like to grow up. So I started writing and wrote 50 or 60 of these articles, and they put them on their site, and then they were in a seniors magazine, and I kept writing and ended up writing books.
You got the writing bug from writing all these articles.
I did. I got hooked. Yeah, it's been fun. I've learned a lot too.
I'm sure you have. Yes. Yeah. So how did you go from writing articles, which would be a couple thousand words, to a full novel?
Well, we had a website back then. It's no longer in existence, but we would submit our articles to the site and update it and kept it going, article after article. There was about 4 or 5 of us, some of these literary types. And then one day we were just talking, we should write a serialized story, sort of like Dickens did, and that people might want to, look for the next article.
There'd be a hook on each time to get them coming back.
Yeah, to entice them. Anyways, we talked about the idea of a book, and I considered it, and I had ideas for writing a book. And in early 2017, I started writing. And the book was finally, after much editing, a 2-year project, completed and published in late 2018.
Okay, so both your books, bit of a mystery, a lot of historical information, very factual, and a bit of medical all thrown in.
So when people stop by at our booth at the farmer's market, they say, "What kind of book is this?" I say, "Well, it's a historical fiction / medical thriller." And then we go from there, and I have little tapes, like in 30-second promotionals that I give them. So yeah, they're both historical fictions, medical thrillers. So I guess I've been a family doctor for 47 years, and I've always been a history nerd. So combine the two together, and you get a guy who's interested in the history of diseases, and specifically infectious diseases. Well, then make a mystery out of it. Introduce some interesting characters and see what you can do with them. And that's basically how the books were written.
And how did you choose which mystery?
Well, it all started after 9/11, and I was reading the papers a lot. And as we all know, the Americans went to fight in Afghanistan. And one of the things the American military was doing was vaccinating all their soldiers that were going over there for smallpox. Really. I had given vaccines for smallpox when I was a young physician back in the late 70s, but they stopped doing it after 1980 because the disease was eradicated from the face of the earth. And
so it's gone, but we're still vaccinating
Well,
soldiers.
Then I thought, why are they doing this? American military knows something, right? And over the next decade, they vaccinated 750,000 soldiers and 35,000 medical nursing people. So they were worried that just as the evil genius of the Al-Qaeda blew up those Twin Towers, maybe they could come up with a form of bioterrorism via smallpox. It got me thinking. Well, and I started researching and found out that smallpox does, in fact, exist in 2 labs in the world. People often say, is it in Winnipeg? Is it in Winnipeg's big lab? No, it's not, thank goodness. But it is still in one lab in the CDC in Atlanta and one in Russia. And then I started thinking, but surely it could be in the permafrost. People died of the disease hundreds of years ago. Well, it's a freezer. Why couldn't it still be viable there?
So permafrost and Northern.
All that stuff fit into a story. I got a lot of history, and I tried to weave a narrative with characters that would bring this whole thing to a mystery and to an exciting conclusion. I think and it's been selling well. I can't complain.
And this is your first book, A Deadly Thaw.
Yeah, it's the first book, A Deadly Thaw. published in 218, Life Reason Press.
And you were talking about the permafrost, so you placed the book, part of it, in York Factory in northern Manitoba.
Yeah, so I thought, well, if there was someone buried with smallpox in permafrost, that's a big supposition. Well, lo and behold, in my research and reading, I discovered that there were, in July the 3rd, 1780s, there were 3 First Nations Chippewan paddlers that worked for the Hudson's Bay Company that contracted smallpox and died and were buried in the cemetery at York Factory. And a week later, 3 more died of smallpox and were buried there, and they quarantined the whole fort. So we got it in the ground. Smallpox is in the ground, and not just any ground, permafrost. Now what happens?
And from reading your book, you talked about 1781-82 being a smallpox epidemic at that time.
It was very big. It affected the Revolutionary War in the States. It swept across America and came up through many of the indigenous peoples because they did a lot of trading. It went all the way up to Alaska. It hammered people. People think that the cases that happened in York Factory came from the ships, but no, it came from inland. And wisely, the Hudson's Bay factors, they put a quarantine around the whole place and saved a lot of lives by doing that.
To contain it.
Yeah, yeah. A horrible disease. And the book deals with it and how it was transmitted and how vaccinations were first developed and a lot of medical stuff. But it's not overly medicalized. People can read it. No. Try to keep it simple.
It was fairly high mortality rate at that time.
Yeah. There were 2 types of smallpox. Variola, it was called, variola minor. Mortality rate very low, 1 or 2%. But then variola major would kill up to 30 to 35%. And for some reason, First Nation people were particularly vulnerable, and they think it could have been as high as 50% in some areas. So, yeah, it was a horrible scourge. It killed 500 million people in the past 100 years alone.
What I also found quite fascinating is your prescient. Smallpox, now we're dealing with monkeypox. You're talking about a pandemic, and then the story goes into how it comes into the present, and compare it to COVID. Yeah.
Well, I get that question a lot. I get a lot of people at the market coming up, I read your book, and how did you know we were going to have a pandemic? And I said, I didn't. It just seemed natural that we're waiting for a pandemic. We're thinking of influenza since 1918, flu epidemic, and I thought something was going to happen. Just knew, and so I wrote about this, and lo and behold, yes, we get a pandemic. Not
quite the same, but still.
Not the same, but yeah.
Yes. And I liked that you got it right, that the cruise industry would be shut down. Yeah. You didn't quite get it right that everybody would step up to be vaccinated.
Yeah, no. Well, but I did refer to anti-vaxxers in the one part of the book. Some of the doctors are giving a lecture on smallpox in the book and the current outbreak that they're dealing with. And of course, it's anti-vaxxers with their signs and complaining. But I'll tell you, there wouldn't be too many anti-vaxxers if smallpox ever did escape. We would.
Just with its mortality.
And none of us are really protected from smallpox, even though you and I probably had it when we were kids. It's long worn off. It's only good for 5 to 10 years. So that's what the book deals with. It's a book about a pandemic that happened before the pandemic. It deals a lot with the fur trade, bioterrorism, First Nations, climate change, permafrost. So touches a lot of buttons. And then I wrote the sequel.
Well, before we get into that, we're just going to take a short break, and then we'll come back. And I would like to hear more about York Factory, and then we'll talk about the sequel for sure.
Certainly. Yep.
So please come back. Welcome back to Sitting with Sallie. I am talking to Dr. Frederick Ross, who wrote A Deadly Thaw and Desert Enigma. And just before the break, we were talking about A Deadly Thaw, and I thought maybe you could just give a little bit more of an outline.
Well, the subtitle is The York Factory Connection. So the book deals with York Factory, and to write about it, I had to go there. And my son and I went up. We flew up to Gillam, spent a night in a hotel, got up early, drove past the 3 dams, got on a boat, special jet boat that takes you down into Hudson's Bay and then up to the York factory, which was built in 1835, 36, and is still standing.
So York factory, you're talking about going down Hudson's Bay to the Hayes River?
Yes.
And you had to go by jet boat?
You had to go way out, about 10 miles into Hudson's Bay, and you have to work the tides. And the guy that does this has done a lot of it, and he's very familiar with taking boats into Hudson's Bay. And then you go up the Hayes, and then there's someone from Parks Canada that'll greet you, carrying a 12-gauge shotgun in case there's any polar bears, because there are quite a few. In fact, that comes out in the book.
I was going to say there's a little polar bear incident.
So the main protagonist of the book is a 32-year-old archaeologist named Rachel Thompson, who goes up to York Factory to do an archaeological project looking for something unrelated. And so it describes their trip up there and what they find. They're looking for the cause of an ancient disease that really happened at York Factory back in the 1830s. So she inadvertently makes a discovery. I don't want to spoil the book or the plot for anyone, but you get the idea from the title, A Deadly Thaw, something in the permafrost. And she reappears in the second book, the sequel.
Right, but before we get that, one of the things I found very interesting, because you talked about bioterrorism earlier, is that is a fear, but in A Deadly Thaw, something accidental, totally inadvertent happens, which is just as deadly as a deliberate act. Right.
So the reader, I'm trying to leave the reader a little bit mystified as to where this comes out. Was it an intentional act of bioterrorism? Was it accidental? Was it from the permafrost? Was it a leak from some biofreezer?
An angry god?
Yeah. Anyways, it comes out, and the medical mystery is, how did it come out?
Right.
How could it come out? So I try to make it plausible without getting far-fetched. There's no science fiction in it. It's strictly a historical fiction.
And the other interesting thing, which I think we've talked about, is a pandemic. I found that some of the medical facts I was much more comfortable with because of COVID, like PCR tests.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly, I'm saying, I know what they're about.
That's right. And when you'd read the book after it first came out, you probably have to look that up and wonder what it's all about. But having watched television for the past 2 years with medical people on every single day, you get familiar with some of the terminology and the testing that they do. So you're probably in a better shape to read A Deadly Thaw now than had you been in 2018.
Dr. Isaac Bogosh.
Yeah.
And apparently he bought the book.
Well, I gave it to him.
You gave it to him.
He walked by right in front of us, our booth at the Madiowski Farmers Market just a few weeks ago, and we discussed the monkeypox issue and how smallpox vaccines been used to treat the contacts of those people with monkeypox, who I would never have believed that smallpox vaccine would have been used other than in my fiction book. But now,
it's come back.
It protects people 85% of the time if you're in contact with it. So.
And one of the things you have to do, because you've publishing these books, is go out and sell them.
Yes, just because you think writing a book's difficult, try selling them. And I did a lot of research for both of them. I had to not just read about it, I had to go there, I had to explore things. And in the sequel book, I had to go there and climb and speak to docents and historians and stuff. I consulted a lot of medical people for this book, infectious disease specialists, epidemiologists, historians. So it's been, I think, fairly well researched. But you just don't want it to be a boring read. You want to have some excitement. Hence, you create characters and carry the narrative, weaving it through Canada's fur trade and the history of disease. So, yeah.
Okay, well, we'll take another short break, and then maybe you'll talk a little bit about Desert Enigma.
It's a hard word to pronounce, but yeah, Enigma.
Yeah, I get it, but...
Well, the guy on the radio had the same difficulty, so yeah.
So come back in a moment. Welcome back to Sitting with Sally. I have with me Dr. Frederick Ross, who has written A Deadly Thaw, and Desert Enigma.
Hard to pronounce.
Almost got it. So we're now going to talk about Desert Enigma.
So, A Deadly Thaw was popular. I've sold quite a few books, and people kept asking me, is that all you're going to write? And so I brought the two main characters, the protagonist, Rachel Thompson, who's the archaeologist in A Deadly Thaw, and she gets married. I won't spoil it that, but she and her husband, Rolly, end up in New Mexico in another archaeological project. She lost her job at the end of the first book, and she's now reappeared in New Mexico, and she's very interested in a place called Chaco Canyon, where the ancient Anasazi people once lived. These are actually called Ancient Ones, and it's felt that most of the Pueblo native people in New Mexico and Arizona are descendants. And so she goes down and runs into a new adventure. The book, Desert Enigma, is written in alternating narratives. So it starts off in the past, present, past, present. The reader gets used to it after a while. Although I've had some people say, I just read every odd chapter first and then every even chapter later. I said, well, not the way it's supposed to be done. No. Trying to intertwine two narratives and have them merge at the end, right? So it was done in that style.
And you tackle, we won't go into the solution, but you tackle a real mystery. The Anasazi disappeared en masse.
Yes, and I've read a number of books as to what could possibly have happened to this sophisticated ancient people who built great houses in the middle of the desert 1,000 years ago. Huge buildings, 5 stories tall, made of slate and blocks and stones that could house 500 people. And there's about 8 or 9 of them in this Chaco Canyon area. It's really a remarkable, it's hard to get to. It's quite a desolate place. Mm-hmm. But once you get there, you realize this was a site of quite a civilization, quite a sophisticated people.
And they would quite often build them against cliffs,
yes.
and which would provide shade and cooling. It was,
And there's a great house in Chaco Canyon called Bonito Pueblo, and they built it close to a cliff, unfortunately too close. And in the late 1940s, after standing for 1,000 years, a huge slab fell on one of the buildings, and of course irreparable, but it's still there. It is so interesting to go back that far in time and see how people lived. And but they disappeared.
The Anasazi or the
people.
Ancient Pueblans, when do they disappear?
Well, probably around 1100s, 1200, around that area. It's hard to be sure, and most of the dating is pretty close because they use what's called Dendro Chronology. They used a lot of wood in these great houses. They carried logs up to 50, 60 miles, huge logs, thousands of them. As many as 250,000 big logs were transported. Well, they just left a perfect footprint of time, because each log has the rings and they can match them. So they know almost to the year when a certain log was left there and when certain events took place. So through Dendro Chronology, they can pretty well state that they just migrated somewhere else or disappeared, and they don't know why. And the current theory is that there was a drought, and they can tell the drought years again through looking at the tree rings. So I have my own mysterious
You have your own solution.
Yeah, yes, I have a solution. Being a doctor, I think medically and think of diseases. And Rachel stumbles upon this with her new colleagues. So she runs into 3 new colleagues at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque and Department of Anthropology. And these 3 Americans take her under their wing, and they do this project.
The mystery really is quite fascinating because it is unanswered despite so many people doing research. Similar in Arizona, I think, with the Sinaguans, because they all disappeared about the 1440s.
All of them did.
Yes.
Yeah, there's quite a few that disappeared. The Sinaguans too. They say because of lack of water. And now we're looking at lack of water in Arizona once again. The worst drought in 1,000 years is happening as we speak.
So that may be providing an answer, yes.
Yeah, we'll see what happens, but they need water.
So it sounds like you had quite fun taking Rachel and Rolly and putting them into these 2 situations.
Yes, I kind of got attached to the characters and developed the relationship with each other and with others. and had to research both of these places, going all the way up to York Factory and going down to Chaco Canyon, two desolate areas, hard to get at, rich in history, and yes, both attached to a specific disease, which I brought in.
And you've talked about how much research you did. I really did appreciate in reading them the authenticity, both of the history, but the medical information
I
too.
tried to keep it as accurate as possible and consulted as many people as I could. And there has been a lot of archaeological research done in Chaco Canyon, as you can appreciate. It's been well written about, but they still don't know where these people went.
They may never know.
It's a mystery.
Yeah.
Well, I like to try and think I can solve that mystery.
Yes, maybe you have solved it. Yes.
Through medical eyes, right?
So I gather you're a bit addicted to writing. So what are you planning next?
Well, as I said earlier, I was writing historical vignettes for this radio station, and I wrote enough of them. And so I've written a book that's really a compendium. It's called Canadian Boomer, Growing Up in the 50s and 60s. So the target audience would be people our age who grew up in the 50s and 60s and remember a lot of these things.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's, and my wife has written, or ghost-written a number of articles, what it was like for her to grow up on the farm and for me to grow up in the city. And so it'll be an entertaining, easy read. Be able to open it anywhere in the book. You don't have to follow a distinct narrative such as these were.
There'll be short stories.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then I'm also considering finishing a trilogy with Rachel and Rolly in another adventure, and it's already begun.
And do you know where you're going?
Well, it'll be in the Winnipeg area. Yeah.
Another mystery.
Another medical mystery that features, going back in time to First Nations people and how they lived. And that takes a lot of work.
And I think too, Rolly, who's a pilot, is Métis, so you bring some of his
And he's got a good sense of humor, and he lightens things up, and he's far more knowledgeable than people give him credit for. And in fact, a lot of the bush pilots learned a lot about the Canadian North and history, mining, engineering, anthropology, because they're flying these guys up, university people. So they became quite bright and quite educated just through their contacts.
And when can we look forward to your compendium of short stories?
Hopefully within the next 6 months.
Oh.
It's all done. I just have to edit it and clean it up a bit.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah. So I'm writing a lot of other stuff too, so it keeps me hopping.
You're quite the busy beaver.
Well, I'm retired now, so I've always wanted to do this, and now I'm doing it.
That's great. And people can find you at the market for sure?
Well, I love going to the market here in Kenora. It's get to know other vendors, and the Kenora people have been great to me. They've really been very appreciative, and I like the atmosphere, and it's fun.
Good. So pop down to the market on a Wednesday and say hello to Dr. Ross and hopefully get one of his books.
Absolutely. A signed book.
A signed book, oh, even better. A Deadly Thaw or Desert Enigma.
Thank you.
Thank you. Join us again.